to a video of Matt and Bentley riffing on interesting topics. I'm Bentley. I'm a developer advocate on the developer experience team at Atlassian. It's a mouthful. Matt, who are you?
Yeah, hi, I'm Matt. I'm a principal developer on Trello and have been for a little bit over the last 6 years now, focusing mostly on kind of ecosystem development and ecosystem kind of creation.
And today we are going to talk about something that we've both been sending DMs to each other about and trying to wrap our heads around and make sure that we're being responsible developers. Matt, far more responsible than I am. And so we're going to talk about CSPs.
Yeah, and this is definitely not the second take of that. This is definitely the first take. We've definitely got it right the first try.
CSPs, what do they stand for? Cyber security professionals.
Oh, I like that actually. That might be your best one yet.
Crappy system preferences.
I mean, it might actually be all of these, of course. The worst thing about acronyms is they don't, like, an acronym itself doesn't really tell you, there's without plenty of additional context. So I guess the context in this video is that we both work on software and ecosystems, and we're talking about security. So we're probably talking about content security policies, although cybersecurity expert professionals in the same vein. Speaking of poor acronyms, or is it initialisms? I forget which one is which. A CSP is primarily designed, right, from a security standpoint to protect you from another acronym. Of course, this acronym is even worse. It's not even an initialism, XSS. And well, what's that? What does the X stand for? Is it like xylophone or something? There's not a lot of X words.
On the spot, coming up with an X one's hard, a funny one's hard. So yeah, CSPs, they protect us from XSS.
Right, and why is it called XSS? Because CSS was already taken.
Like railroad crossing, like, right? Railroad Xing?
Right, yeah, railroad Xing, because they ran out of space on the sign. I mean, I'll forgive them that because they had, limited space on the sign for traffic, but right, XSS in our context, right, cross-site scripting, generally referring to some JavaScript running on your site that you didn't really intend to be running on your website.
So a CSP, for people that aren't familiar, it's content security policy. And I'm going to give you Bentley's bad understanding of it, and you correct me where I'm wrong. It is a way for me as an owner of a website domain. I can specify on my page some rules around what types of things that I want to be allowed to happen on my page, where they come from and what they do.
Yeah, I mean, I would describe that as fairly high level.
Okay.
You're like somebody who tells your future or something, right? Where it's like, if I just stay broad enough, I'll always be right, and it'll look really compelling.
Bam, you nailed it. Life from 1,000 feet.
Right. So maybe you do have a future in fortune telling, I suppose. But let's try to go a little bit beyond just that, right? Like policy, like when we say, right, even you said domain, right? Like, as the owner of a domain, what do you actually own when you own a domain, right? What are we talking about there?
DNS rules, routing stuff to pages, and where those requests end up resolving through a IP address. Yeah.
Oh, I feel like we went a little bit too live. I pushed you and now we went too deep. That's on me. Right. So if you're Alphabet, right, then you own the domain google.com, right? And you're right. Like, yes, that ownership of that means that you get to set up the DNS records and say, okay, yeah, when somebody requests google.com, send them to my servers over here. Which is a fairly good point, because of course, if you send them to servers elsewhere, that's a whole different class of security attacks that I think we're not going to be talking about on this particular video. So great, you get to set up the rules, they send them to you, all traffic for that domain goes to your server. It means you get to serve the traffic for that domain. I guess in the context of this, we're talking about websites. So when somebody hits your domain, you're serving them a web page. Right, so that's like an HTML page, right? We really throw around, it's hard to not throw around lots of letters. HTML hypertext markup language, probably irrelevant mostly for the context of this, but I feel like if we're going to be defining all of our acronyms, we should stick with it. And although I probably said HTTP, right? Hypertext transfer protocol.
We got them all. We need to keep a counter somewhere of all.
Although you said DNS, which I feel like we didn't get that one either.
Okay, so CSPs, you're starting on a little bit more of what they actually are, a level deeper than what I said.
Right. I mean, a content security policy, if you gave a circular definition of it's a security policy for your domain, yeah, it's bound to be right. More important, like what is a security policy for your domain? We've spoken about this before. I think like it's kind of fair to think about it like an insurance policy for your car, right? Which is to say that somebody has, in that case, your insurance company has written down, and you as the owner of the car have agreed to exactly what things, but very particularly what things and to what limits the insurance company is willing to cover you for. And so you've entered essentially into this contractual agreement between yourself and the insurance company that like, okay, here's exactly what I will cover you for and what I won't. In this case, the contractual kind of obligation is between you, the owner of the domain, the one providing the security policy, and the browser, right? The browser is the one that executes the code and scripts and stuff served to it on your domain. So you're writing the policy and the browser is the one kind of agreeing to it, kind of signing on the dotted line saying, okay, I agreed to this policy. I will follow your policy to exactly what you say, right? It's perhaps much more explicit than a insurance policy because there's no court of law, right? There's no humans that get to read between the lines, if you will, right? There's no between the lines. It's very explicit, which is perhaps one of the things I think that I've come to like about a content security policy is the explicitness that it forces upon you to be like, you must tell the browser exactly what it's allowed to do, because if anything that you don't, the browser will not do. So I think like, maybe what would help with this conversation is like kind of looking at one, and then we can kind of talk through what one of them looks like. So we'll take a quick look here and peek at one. Okay, so we're looking at Firefox. How does this look to you? Look all good? Does it need to be bigger?
No, looks fine.
Cool. Right now we're just on MDN, right? At my favorite source of actually learning about these different things. And conveniently, Firefox has also created a little bit of a browser extension, but I'm sure you can find one for different browsers that will let you, for any particular website, record even one, and this is kind of the important bit, right? Even one that doesn't implement a content security policy, tell you based on what the browser executed, what a content security policy for that website could have been, right? This is nice, right? So that if you're, as a developer, if you need a starting point, right? You're like, okay, I want to implement one of these for my website. This is a great way to like get yourself a starting point, right? Like, okay, here's what Firefox is telling me I would need to have as a content security policy if I wanted everything to continue to execute. But we'll see as we go deeper, you can probably do better than whatever Firefox tells you. So I feel like as a guinea pig, let's try the New York Times, right? Like let's see what, if they had a content security policy, what it would be. So we're going to tell Firefox to record the website. I'm going to refresh it so that way all the scripts and stuff get to be executed. And there we go. It's nice, and we got a nice long one. And so now I copied that, and we're going to actually switch what we're looking at here because it'll be a lot easier to look at this in kind of a text editor. Okay, so that's another one. Oh, boy, did we pick a rough one. So again, it turns out we're probably not going to talk through this one too much because of how monstrous it is. But I do think actually that this is I think there's something nice here. Let's just help ourselves read this a smidge. Okay. We talked about briefly, right, how explicit you need to be with a content security policy, right? You need to say for the browser, like, hey, here's exactly what you're allowed to do, from exactly which domains you're allowed to do that. I mean, you can be kind of as explicit as you want. And so what's kind of happening here is Firefox recorded, right? Like, let's take connect source. Connect source is the part of the CSP that says, okay, well, what domains, right? Where am I allowed to make requests to? Like, what things can I connect to, right? So a classic example of this is like XHRs and things. So, right, so like if you have a super simple website, this might just be yourself, right? Connect source self. I only connect to my own API. Nope, I don't connect to anybody else. But of course, we can see that no, the New York Times connects to way more than just themselves. They've got some tracking on some. Looks like they've got a subdomain A and A.et, right? And then they've got seems like lots of subdomains, and they also connect to other people, right? Kind of neat, right? We're actually getting to see under the covers all the things that New York Times did, right? Where did it load its fonts from? Turns out it serves its fonts from a completely different domain as well. Or
in particular, they're very specific about. And let me back up a second, because there's. I want to make sure that we differentiate between what we're looking at now as the generated CSP.
Exactly. This is not necessarily. New York Times may or may not provide a CSP. We'll have to go back and take a look and see if they do actually provide one. This is instead Firefox's take on, hey, if you want me to let everything that I did to load this page happen, like at a minimum, here is what you would need to tell me, right? Here's what you would need to allow to let everything I did happen. So this is that, right? This is the Firefox looking, and so it may well be the case that this is missing things, right? I suppose that's an easy trap to walk into, is if you're using this to record your page, well, you better make sure that you kind of exercise the different features of your page, or this might miss some calls to some other services that only happen under certain conditions, or when a button is clicked, or things like that.
Right, and I guess kind of in the other direction of missing things, like thinking about, I'm a lazy developer. And I assume when we go and put New York Times, we'll probably see this, where I don't have to specify the full URI for all of these assets. I could say, for instance, if we're looking at like image source,
yeah, this is a great one.
No, but it's only two. Like script source, do they have multiple? No, can you scroll back up?
Yeah, I think I kind of see what you're getting at, and I think
those first two, instead of saying the a.et.newyorktimes.com, I could just say newyorktimes.com, and it would capture everything under the New York Times domain.
I think you would need a star dot. I think you would need to wildcard the subdomain. But if you did, of course, wildcard the subdomain, then yes, that would let you say, yeah, anything has a top level domain of newyorktimes.com is cool. It doesn't matter. The subdomain, I'm allowed to connect to any of those. Now, we're getting into something interesting here, right? Which is that the main benefit of the content security policy is in its explicitness. So anytime you choose to be less explicit, you're giving up some of the benefit of the policy, right? You're saying, because should somebody somehow manage to take control of one of your subdomains, right? Let's say b.nytimes.com. Well, if you had wildcarded it, well, now you're allowed, whereas this is kind of, the browser will not let you connect to b.nytimes.com, accidentally, because you haven't kind of explicitly allowed it. So I think a lot of the safety from this thing comes with being as explicit as you can be. I think let's take a simpler example here and kind of bring us back to the ecosystem track. This is a much simpler content security policy, and this one comes from one of Trello's power-ups, dash cards in this case. And we can go look at the power-up in a bit, but before we do that, let's just kind of look through some of what it's describing as its policy, right? So the policy is kind of made up of directives, and MDN is going to have all the information you're going to want on each of these individual directives. And then for each directive, you get to say, well, for that directive, what's allowed, with the default kind of being your fallback, right? So if you don't specify a directive, but you did specify the default, well, that's your fallback then. And I think that what we were talking about is a good example of what we were talking about here of like being kind of open, but still less open than not saying anything at all is like the way that the image source here is saying, okay, I'm allowed, you can show images from my own domain, but you can also show any image that's hosted on HTTPS, right? Like, so that's good, right? So what we're saying here is, or rather, it's better than nothing, right? Like we're not going to show HTTP images because we've told the browser not. We're not going to show data URI images, right? Because again, we've told the browser not, right? So and right, anything else, right? Anything that's not an HTTPS image or an image from our own domain will not be shown by the browser because we didn't tell it could, so it won't. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, and I think there's an interesting thing here where the left hand of the CSP in source space URI image source, that is the functionality. So that is the what.
The directive, yep.
Yeah, and then the right hand side is the who. Right, we're saying who can do what. One question I have is, can I say none for image source? Say I explicitly don't have any images, so I assume, can I say none?
You definitely can say none, right? And I think just as important that is like the like why would you do that, right? If you're displaying no images, but you are doing some other things, so you have like a default source of self, or sometimes maybe you'll do a default source of none, right? So that you will have no fallback. So anything you don't describe is just strictly not allowed. And then, right, and then use that to be more careful, right? I think that would make a more complete policy, right? Would be to say none on my default source so that my fallback is empty, right? That way, if I've left anything out, it's not going to happen.
Right.
And then force ourselves to be even more explicit on every one of the directives to make sure that we're covering our bases there.
So this all makes sense. I think that one of the things I want to make sure we get back to is how do I actually do this?
And also how does it protect you from XSS, which is the described primary objective here, right?
Right.
And okay, so let's stop looking at that for a moment. Okay, so before we talk about how we would implement it, and before we talk about how it protects you from XSS, let's talk just a smidge more about what is XSS, right? Like what the thing that we're trying to protect ourselves from, what is it and why is it bad? Why is it something we need to be protecting ourselves from in the first place? Right? I'm already hosting my website on HTTPS. Aren't I already protected? Isn't that S in HTTPS secure? What am I missing?
Right. Like I think the thing that we see the most often in the context of our work, and for clarity, Matt and I have both worked on the Trailer Power Up platform and the greater Atlassian platform. And I think the most common XSS attack that we see is someone not sanitizing or someone taking user input and kind of blindly injecting it into the DOM and not thinking anything about it. So what happens is you have a little text box somewhere that someone fills out, they throw some JavaScript in there, they hit save, your plugin, power up, application, whatever, pulls that onto the DOM, doesn't say anything about it, doesn't clean it, doesn't say, hey, let me make sure this isn't JavaScript, and just jams it on the DOM, and all of a sudden that JavaScript executes. I think that's that's the vector of attack that I think we probably see most often.
I would step back further and say that right, there are a variety of different attacks or vulnerabilities for when you're running a website, and so as a starting point, right, like the cross-site request forgery, CSRF, right, the XSS, there's a handful of these different things, and I think kind of I agree with you, right, like the most common used or reported vector is cross-site scripting, XSS, and of XSS, right? You're right that it tends to be, what I would describe as accidentally letting user-generated content find its way into the DOM without being sanitized. But I feel like the way you word that, it almost feels like, well, I'm a good developer. I know that. I know that. I've known that for largely as long as I've been writing websites. I have still personally been responsible for more than one XSS, right? Like I don't keep count, but I'm probably at least 3 or 4 deep in my career at this point. But I do know, don't put unsafe content into the DOM. So it's like one of those things where like it sounds easy, but man, is that easy to mess up. Like it was surprisingly easy to get that wrong, right? Like, because I think we wouldn't even be talking about content security policy if it was harder, right? Like if it wasn't so easy to kind of mess up and whoops, something that you didn't sanitize has found its way into the browser, and the browser has decided to kind of, oh, well, that looks executable. Let me go ahead and execute that code.
Right. So I guess another thing that we would solve, just thinking through these, it would be the case where a domain or like a subdomain gets hijacked and redirects to somewhere else would be a place. So we're explicitly saying in our CSP, don't pull images from this domain, or rather we're saying, I got that wrong. We're saying explicitly only pull images from this domain.
Right.
So we're trying, there are ways that our page could be asked to get images from other domains.
Yep. I mean, that's a classic, I would describe that's a classic XSS you see, right? As somebody like you're putting the source of an image to something, but turns out you didn't fully send, like you don't have full control over the source of that image. And whoever does actually have control over the source of that image changes it so that it's like broken, then puts like a closing quote there to close off that. And then they put an on error so that when the browser is like, oh, I tried to load the thing, but it was broken, I'm going to execute your on error callback that was provided by the person providing the source. And great, now their code executes, right? Like,
right.
Yeah, that wouldn't have happened for a variety of reasons, right? The browser wouldn't have tried to load the image because whatever broken thing they put in there is not going to be allowed in your policy. But even then, even if it was allowed in your policy, because whatever, you can still protect yourself with the script source portion, right? It's like, okay, fine, your image source, let that image load. It failed to load. Now that on error thing that the attacker was injected into your DOM, document object model. We're still hard on the acronyms here. And now that on error thing is going to run. However, it won't run unless you've explicitly allowed for that in your content security policy, right? That's your, in this case, that's your like fallback protection there. And perhaps from XSS standpoint, that's your primary protection in that thing. I think one more thing before we go into, okay, how do I add this to my website? What's bad about somebody's code running on your website, right? Like, why is that bad? What's the like harm there?
Yeah, I mean, they can, the one that always comes to mind for me is they can begin to pretend like they are you and throw open a, hey, you're logged out, use this form to log back in, and it posts to something. It's a form that just blasts the credentials to wherever they choose. So it's very easy to get access to someone's like password.
Yeah, I mean, I would describe that as a fairly incredible form of phishing, and phishing on the domain in question. And even more so, right? If the user is already logged in, you don't even need to phish their credit, right? You don't even need them to trust the thing. You just send their cookie or their token your way, and now you are, for all intents and purposes, them. Right. Which is kind of the classic XSS attack of like, okay, look, I can send myself the user's cookie. Now I am your user. I've won. And none of us want that to happen. So right. we try to do everything we can to protect, right? We use frameworks, right? Like frameworks like React. I think we've spoken about this. Like I quite like that React chose to put this into the DOM without sanitizing it, dangerously set inner HTML, right? Like right. There's some niceness to that syntax, right? Of like, okay, just know that what you're doing is dangerous, right? Like you want to do this, like fine, but no, it's dangerous. Right, so that's kind of one way that we protect ourselves. Like, great, already, I'm already using React, so I should be already a bit protected. Doesn't mean you can't still mess up. You very much can. My favorite, of course, is like the classic, the JavaScript protocol, right? So like, cool, you're putting stuff in it via React, but then you have an unsanitized, back to like a source of an image or a URL, like an ahref somewhere. Honestly, the ahref is probably the primary culprit here, and you don't realize that you don't fully control the URL for that anchor tag, and it's going to be JavaScript : boom, some script. And even better, you might think, like I used to think, like, why the hell would that? Okay, if somebody clicks on that link, certainly it's not going to execute that code on my domain, right? No, it very much is going to execute that code on your domain, because this predates probably both of us, and like goes back to like bookmarklets and stuff, and that's how those worked, right? Is your bookmarklet was just like a little bit of JavaScript, and the whole reason the bookmarklet worked was because it ran on the domain in question. So great, like you use React, that's good, you've protected yourself a bit, but you can still do more. So let's try to do more. I have one way for us to look at this, which is in here. So if you're a developer making power-ups, right, and you think to yourself, oh, I'd like to add a little bit of extra security to my power-up. I think a good starting point, and this is going to be a smidge Netlify specific, but we'll back that out so that can make sense more or less. Right. So for Netlify is serving our content, and that means Netlify is setting our headers for our content, and that's kind of the key here. If you're trying to write a good content security policy, so MDN will tell you that you can use a meta tag, which is to say, right, in your HTML page, you could put a meta tag in the head that lists, your content security policy. That's good. I consider that kind of like a fallback if you really can't set the header, the content security policy header in the response, because the meta tag doesn't support every single directive. So you're likely to kind of run into some troubles there. But if for some reason you really can't, you have no control over setting the response headers via whatever you're using to serve your power up, hey, like this is still better than nothing, right? Great. I assume you control your HTML content. You can throw this meta tag in there and give a content security policy directly in there. If we come back to Netlify's case, Netlify has its own, I think this is a YAML or TOML. Speaking of, I truly do not know what TOML stands for. So despite trying.
Text or markup language? I don't know.
It's a good guess.
Just to contextualize this a little bit, we're using Netlify here because our power up is a static page. Mm-hmm. We actually don't need a server. There's no kind of dynamic back and forth that requires us having a server. So Netlify is acting as our web server for the static content.
Yep, and in this case, probably more of a CDN. Oh, Jesus, I didn't realize it was a content delivery network. Because of that, because most of it is static. I think actually in one of our previous videos, we made the weather power up have a backend. So the weather power up does actually have a backend now and can serve some headers for those particular API requests, but that's for API requests, not serving the content. And we want I should put this right. When you're serving the response header with the CSP, the one that you want that on is the page, right? You want to serve that content security policy for the page, so for the HTML page itself, right? You don't, right? I don't know what it would mean to serve it on your CSS content, right?
Yeah, or like a JSON response, too. Right?
Exactly, your API response with JSON. Like, there's no harm, but it's also not like this comes along with the HTML page response, and we might be able to look at that in the network panel, but right. So again, for Netlify, we're telling Netlify because it's our CDN, right? And different CDNs have different way of configuring headers to return with your, like, so if you're using Cloudflare, it'll be different. If you're using CloudFront, it'll be different. But they should all have ways for you to tell them, like, I would like you to include these additional headers when you serve my content, please. And so, right, critically here, we've got our content security. So we've got a couple other ones, and we're not going to get into these, but these are nice. I've never known XSS protection to like save my butt. But hey, it's there, so why don't we turn it on? And so the one that we're curious about here is this content security policy. So this is us telling Netlify, and again, I bring this up because if you're making a power up, this is a great starting point for your content security policy, because some of these things you're going to need, right? Frame ancestors. That's you saying who is allowed to show this page in an iframe. And of course, that's how Trello power-ups work. They're loaded in an iframe. So if you didn't say that Trello.com can show you in an iframe, well, then your power-up's not going to work, right? Like what's going to happen is the browser is going to create the iframe, try to load you. They're going to get your content security policy with the header as it loads you, which says, maybe it says no frame ancestors, maybe it says some other ones, but it doesn't say Trello. And that's it. The browser is not going to put you into that frame. It's not going to run any of your code. And so this is great. Like Trello ourselves, we use this. This is protecting you from a whole different class of attacks like clickjacking, right? Where somebody puts your content in an iframe and click the classic clickjacking case, right? As they like hide you or make that iframe invisible, but like it's still there for clicks, and then they can, right? I think the like textbook example is like tweets, right? Like you embed a tweet, and like if Twitter didn't have clickjacking protections, then you could maybe use that as a way to get people to like a tweet a lot, right? Because they don't know that that's what they're doing. They think they're clicking something else, but unbeknownst to them, right, invisible behind that is actually a frame with Twitter anyway. So this is nice because it's now not only are we protecting ourselves from cross-site scripting, which we'll get to in kind of the script source, but because we'll be able to be explicit about, okay, only Trello can iframe me. I trust them. They know they're not going to lead to any clickjacking attacks. Cool. Now nobody else other than Trello can frame our content. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
A style source, right? This one's fairly straightforward. So this is for your CSS and your styles that you're applying to your page. Where should those be loaded from and applied from? This is nice. We'll actually talk about both of these. Both of these two have this thing called Unsafe Inline, which again, I love. I love the naming where when you can put to a name that there is risk associated with it. That's a good thing, right? Like it would be so much worse if they just called it inline, right? So you'd have style source self and then like inline, but there wouldn't be that kind of connotation of like, okay, like sure, inline, fine, I'll execute things that I find inline. But like that is inline is exactly where most of the XSS and stuff that we were talking about stems from. It's like, yep, I put something into the DOM, it's now inline. And so if I tell the browser, yeah, you can do things that are inline, well, then you're telling the browser it can do those things. So if we want to protect ourselves from accidentally putting unsanitized stuff into the DOM, we have to kind of avoid that unsafe inline, both in style source and in script source.
So just to be clear, if we wanted unsafe inline, we explicitly have to opt into.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's nice.
Yeah, exactly. So and I personally have like one of my power-ups has unsafe inline in style source. Right, like I'm explicitly saying, okay, I'm willing to take the risk that like, yes. And to be fair, much like I've been bitten by XSS, I've also been bitten by people being able to inject styles and do some crazy things with styles on me. So, it feels a little bit less risky than the script source, but there is still some risk there. But for some people, right, I think even for me, right, this might require a little bit of change in the way that you package your app or your website, right? Like it used to be common, and it probably still is, to bundle your website, like, and a lot of bundlers will inline all your stuff, right?
Right.
You're probably familiar with this, right? Of like the HTML page as it's building on takes all your JavaScript and it just slams it in, right? Like, and I think that was maybe you remember this a bit more than I do. I think that was just like trying to optimize for HTTP 1, right? Where you can only have 6 concurrent whatever requests by the browser to a single domain. So if you slamming everything into one file was good because HTTP 1 wasn't great about like parallelizing all these different requests.
Right.
But of course, if that's how you're building, that's kind of like CSP is going to struggle to protect you because you have inlined all your stuff. So if you want it to run like that, you're going to have to tell the browser, via the policy, okay, you have to execute unsafe inline, you lose the protection. I think my take is that like nowadays HTTP2, most of the stuff that we use supports HTTP2, and like the cost, right, the overhead of having your JavaScript files separate from your HTML files, separate from your CSS files, has gone down enough so as to be, right, not either no concern at all, or not enough to worry about, right? Especially for the trade-off, right? We're getting notably better security for probably, as long as we're using HTTP2, probably no noticeable difference kind of in load times.
Yeah.
And then we're not going to really talk too much about the rest, right? We spoke about Connect Source when we were looking at the New York Times because they connected to a handful of things. In the case of a power up, right? You'll notice this is going to come up a lot in the case of a power up. Although, right, so because we load PowerUp.js is loaded from here, PowerUp CSS is loaded from here, so that's why we're kind of saying, yep. And you can be more specific. I think like you can go all the way to the path. So this could say, and maybe should say, if you're not using any of Trello's other stuff, okay, you're allowed to load ptrellocdn.com/PowerUp.js, right?
Yeah.
Great. Now you won't accidentally like load any other things that we put on our CDN. So, again, the more explicit you can be, the better. The more you're kind of protecting yourself from accidentally like doing some things.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How common do you, this all makes sense. This is really clean. How often or common do you think it'll be that you need a different CSP per a page? Or
yeah,
right? I assume, and it looked like based on that file that you're via Netlify allowed to do that.
Yep.
Do you think it's the case that most people will get away with one CSP for the majority of their content?
I think so. I think it's the case that so a lot of people, so we have SPAs, right? Single page applications, right? So if you're a single page application, well, then this is kind of irrelevant. If you are indeed a multi-page application, as many PowerUps are, because those are loaded individually into different iframes, my experience says you're fine. You'll be fine with one. Maybe you have to widen that one, which, like maybe because you're like, okay, I can make just one. However, this one page does connect to this, it makes an XHR to this tracking website, or makes an XHR to Sentry, right? So then that becomes your choice, right? Of like, okay, this one page does connect to one or two other things, or has images from one or two other places. I can either have a unified content security policy that I apply to all things that includes that, right? And therefore is saying, yeah, I don't expect to connect to this thing on this particular page, but because I do on another and I want one CSP, I'm going to include it, right? That's probably okay. Again, I'd rather you do that than have no CSP, right? Like this is all kind of a escalating amount of lockdown, right? If you will. Right. It's just like we were talking about, like, okay, you could say, you could say image source star. Great. Okay. But now you haven't really done much for yourself. Okay. You could say image source HTTPS. Okay. You've done something. You're still pretty open to whatever, but you've closed off a lot of avenues there. Right. You're not going to get no image source JavaScript or no things like that. So how much you choose to go beyond that is kind of a question of like time and resources and trade-offs of like, how much extra protection do you feel it is to have different content security policies for each of your pages based on how different your pages behave? And is that worth the extra effort, right? My gut's like, most of the time it's probably not worth the effort. But in the case where your pages do wildly different things, maybe it is. Right.
Right. Yeah. It's all about understanding trade-offs and the value of doing that. All right. So I think we've covered what CSPs are, how you implement them. We've peeked at a power-up that has one. I want to leave a minute to give a nod to Forge and talk about how it handles CSPs. Is there anything else on the non-Forge side?
Yeah, I think there's one last thing that I think is worth knowing, and this can help you both as you implement it and also, right? I mean, you're a human, you might make mistakes when you implement it. how do you know that you made a mistake, right? Once you put that out into the wild, how do you know that you missed something? Right, I think that's kind of important to feel comfortable with what you've done. And content security policies have a kind of a super cool way to do this. I think there's two things that are worth talking about here. You can ship a content security policy in kind of a report only mode, right? But it's not going to block anything, but it will report anything that it would have blocked to you, right? That's a great way to roll out a content security policy.
Yeah.
Right. So this is kind of this report only thing. And so if you want that to work, right, all you need to do with your content security policy is tell it where should it report things that it would have blocked. Right. So that's this report URI thing. You say, okay, anytime you would be blocking something, here's post what you would have blocked to me here. It's very nice. It gives you like the post body of that tells you, okay, it depends. If you're saying report only, then it's going to send you the report. But even when this is still useful, even when you roll it out and you say, no, enforce it. Because then once it starts enforcing it, it will call you here as well, right? It'll say, hey, I'm enforcing your thing, and I chose to block this thing, right? And so you'll have server logs or wherever you choose to send this thing that will tell you, like, and you'll be able to look and see, like, oh, okay, yeah, the browsers are saying they blocked these things. Was that my intention, right? Like, if so, great, like the browser's doing what you want. And if not, if you're like, oh crap, I forgot that, yeah, I connect to that thing, great, like the browser's told you it was doing that. You can now reactively kind of add that back into your content security policy, and you're on your way. So as far as like rolling these things out, right, you have Mozilla Labs to figure out what your thing should be as a starting point. You can turn it on in report only mode so that you feel kind of comfortable based on what it's reporting to you. And then finally, when you lock it down, you still have your report thing so that you can know going forward what's getting blocked, right? So like kind of all steps of your journey there. But yeah, let's talk about getting this kind of quote for free to a certain extent.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that's a great way, I assume, to watch someone pen test you. Start seeing all of the CSP violations.
Or see some, as my experience, see some different like browser extensions trying to do crap with your stuff, and being kind of glad that your policy is blocking them from doing whatever garbage they were trying to do.
Yeah. Right. So a quick nod to Forge, which is a platform for building add-ons and applications on Atlassian's cloud products. And they definitely have thought, prior to Forge, Connect and still is the platform for building plugins, and they work as iframes, very similar to Trello PowerUps. And definitely similar to Trello PowerUps, XSSs are a thing that are easy to let slip in. And so when thinking about adding Forge and building Forge, they definitely said, hey, let's figure out and think through ways that we can cut down on this happening. And the first thing that I think is really nice, and I wish that we would do more of this on the Trello side, is what they call UI Kit. And that is where you let Atlassian take care of pretty much everything. We give you these nice little components, and you don't actually have to worry about owning you're not running a server, you're not running a static app. There's not a HTML page that you're giving us. You're giving us these nice little components, and we take care of the CSPs for you. And similarly, or the alternative UI kit is custom UI. And that's where you actually get to render your pages under your domain that you are running and that you have a service running and returning content for. And so they've added in the ability to explicitly ask for things like unsafe inline. And the really nice thing is that out of the box, they lock it down completely so that you can't not have a CSP. I think it says somewhere in here, yeah, by default, Atlassian blocks any policies that are considered unsafe for your custom UI app. And so you have to go through and explicitly opt in. So it's a way to, it's a nice way to make sure that even the laziest of developers, you have to not be lazy to be unsafe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's to me, that feels like the lesson of all this is like, there is a certain value in being explicit. Humans, we know this, like the court system is built upon this thing of like, yep, the more explicit you can be, the better your end results are going to be, because again, you've stated your intentions, you know your intentions. Like I don't know, my suspicion is a lot of people, when they go make their content security policy, are actually going to learn a lot about the website that they run, right, and be like, wow, I forgot, or I didn't realize that we were sending, we were doing tracking with this, or sending requests to them, or like, and that's probably a good thing, right? Like, I don't know, it feels like not kind of nice to me that you should know, and you should very much say that you know exactly all the things that your website is doing.
You should. That's a great motto to have. I know what my website is doing. Cool. Well, I feel like we have exhausted CSPs. I appreciate, Matt, you taking the time. This was fun.
Yeah, hopefully folks of all different websites will have found this a little bit useful. I think, I think what's interesting is neither you nor I can call ourselves content security policy experts. We're merely,
nor are we cyber
or nor are we security experts. Again, I carry quite a few vulnerabilities to my name, and yeah, we're just developers trying to get a little bit better and try to be a little